So in this video, we're going to be discussing globalization and immigration. The first argument we're going to discuss is the reduction of suffering argument. The argument goes, if we can reduce the suffering of others without incurring significant sacrifice on our part, then we are morally obligated to do so. We can reduce the suffering of the world's poor without incurring significant sacrifice on our part. Therefore, we are morally obligated to reduce the suffering of the world's poor as much as we can, just shy of making a significant sacrifice. So obviously, this is an argument in favor of globalization and immigration to the extent that it helps those people who need to be helped. But what might be some counters to the reduction of suffering argument? Well, the first counter might be that we can reduce the suffering of the others without incurring significant sacrifice on our part, but we are still not required, morally obligated to do so. So maybe there's somebody who could be helped and we could help them, but this in itself doesn't necessarily obligate us to do so. Maybe we could help them without even that much effort or that much cost to ourselves. But perhaps this itself is not morally obligatory. Maybe something else would be required to make it morally obligatory, like a specific responsibility for that specific person or some such. The second counter we could make to the reduction of suffering argument is that we cannot reduce the suffering of the world's poor without incurring significant sacrifice on our part. So this argument would be about effectiveness. Basically, there just isn't any way to reduce the suffering of the world's poor without significant costs and effort to ourselves. Now, this second counter seems less plausible than the first, just because it does seem like there are at least some, ways of helping the poor for relatively little money. In order for this second counter to be plausible, it would have to be shown that there's something deeply self-defeating, perhaps, about helping the world's poor that makes it actually backfire or be completely ineffective. Something like that. The next argument is the international reparations argument. So this argument goes, if country A has perpetrated extensive injustices against country B, then A has a duty to B to repair the harms caused by those injustices. Most of the wealthiest countries of the West have perpetrated extensive injustices against poorer countries. Therefore, most of the wealthiest countries in the West have a duty to repair the harms caused by those injustices. So again, we have an argument in favor of globalization and immigration to the extent that it repairs the injustices done by some countries to other countries. But what might be some counters to the international reparations argument? A first counter might be that country A has perpetrated extensive injustices against country B, but A does not have a duty to B to repair the harms caused by those injustices. We might argue that countries actually do not have such kinds of duties to each other. They do not have duty to repair injustices caused. Maybe we think in this case that countries are amoral entities that don't have obligations to each other. Or maybe we think that there are reasons why some countries can commit injustices against other countries that don't require reparations for those injustices. The second counter could be that most of the wealthiest countries of the West have not perpetrated extensive injustices against poorer countries. This second objection is going to come down to really an empirical, historical question. Did these injustices really occur? How extensive were these injustices? These are questions we have to consult the history books about in order to make judgments on. The third argument we're going to go over is the utilitarian argument. And it goes, we are morally required to do something only if it will improve long-term happiness or reduce overall long-term suffering. Providing famine relief will fail to do either. In fact, it will only increase long-term suffering. Therefore, we are not morally required to provide famine relief. So this is an argument against the globalization and immigration that would be ineffective at reducing long-term suffering, and essentially claiming that these kinds of interventions ultimately don't improve on people's suffering. So what are some counters to the utilitarian argument? First, the first counter is that we may be morally required to do something, but it will not improve long-term happiness or reduce overall long-term suffering. So maybe some requirements are not about happiness or suffering. Maybe some arguments for morality involve other considerations, like justice, for example. The second counter might be that providing famine relief will not fail to do either. In fact, it will only decrease long-term suffering. So it may be that providing famine relief doesn't help, but it may be that providing famine relief actually does help. This seems like an empirical question that we could study and come to some conclusions about. Depending on those conclusions, we might alter our answer regarding this second counter. Another argument is the economics argument, and it goes, nations have a right to protect their economic interests. Restricting immigration will protect the interests of wealthier countries. Therefore, wealthier countries have a right to restrict immigration. So this is an argument against globalization and immigration to the extent that it protects countries' economic interests. So what might be some counters to the economics argument? A first counter might be that nations do not have a right to protect their economic interests. Maybe nations don't have rights at all, or maybe nations have certain rights that don't include economic interest protection, or maybe nations do have a right to their economic interest protection, but it simply isn't strong enough of a consideration and thus can be discarded as one of the rights that we are considering. A second counter might be that restricting immigration will not protect the interests of wealthier countries. Again, this seems like it's probably an empirical question. We might do a study on different nations at different times and see how immigration policies affect the economics of those countries, and then conclude something about whether or not rising immigration improves or harms the interests of the countries that the immigrants are immigrating to. This kind of determination would change our answer regarding counter 2. Another argument is the security argument, and it goes, states have a moral duty to protect their citizens against dangerous attack. Restricting immigration is required to offer that protection. Therefore, states have a moral duty to restrict immigration. Again, this is an argument against globalization and immigration to the extent that those things can harm the citizens that the countries that inhabit the countries. What might be some counters to the security argument? So a first counter might be that states do not have a moral duty to protect their citizens against dangerous attack. Perhaps states have other moral duties and not this one. Or perhaps states have moral duties to all people in the world. Or perhaps states don't have moral duties whatsoever. Or perhaps states have moral duties that supersede this particular moral duty towards protection, and so this particular moral duty towards protection of citizens can be discarded. These would be some considerations to make regarding that first counter. A second counter might be that restricting immigration is not required to offer that protection. So, under this counter, perhaps we can propose other solutions that protect citizens without having to limit immigration at all. If this were the case, then the citizens would be getting what they want, the immigrants would be getting what they want, and the state would be implementing a policy that allows for both of those things to happen without curtailing the rights of either. Whether or not this is possible seems like a consideration of what kinds of implementations can best protect citizens. It's a practical question about what does and does not provide security, how can security be provided at different levels and in different ways. Another argument is the national self-determination argument, and it goes, nations have a right to political self-determination. The right to self-determination includes a right to refuse to associate with others. A nation's right to refuse to associate with others includes the right to close its borders to potential immigrants and others. Therefore, nations have a right to close their borders to potential immigrants and others. Again, this is an argument for limiting globalization and immigration to the extent that nations have the right of self-determination. What might be some counters to the national self-determination argument? First, it may be that nations do not have a right to political self-determination. Maybe nations don't have rights, or maybe nations don't have this particular right. A second counter, the right to self-determination does not include a right to refuse to associate with others. So perhaps nations have this right to self-determination, but they still have to associate with others as part of the deal of existing in an international community. So the self-determination is only to the extent that it doesn't impinge upon the association of others and the self-determination of those others. A third counter might be that a nation's right to refuse to associate does not include the right to close borders to potential immigrants and others. So perhaps a nation has a right to refuse to associate, but perhaps that right to refuse to associate is more specific, and closing borders is not part of that right. It's not inclusive of it's not included in that right. Another argument is the freedom of movement argument. And it goes that freedom of movement is a human right, and so had by all humans. Freedom of movement entails going where you like. Therefore, every human has a right to go wherever he or she likes. Therefore, nations are morally required to open their borders to anyone who wants to gain entry. So what might be some counters to the freedom of movement argument? The first counter might be that freedom of movement is not a human right, not had by all humans. Maybe only some humans have this right, or maybe this right of freedom of movement only applies in a limited way. A second counter might be that we do have this freedom of movement, but it does not entail going where you like. Perhaps freedom of movement entails only going in certain places. Maybe it entails only going where you need. So you're allowed to go where you need to go, but not where you like to go. Another counter is that perhaps nations are not morally required to open their borders to anyone who wants to gain entry. So just because humans have this right, it may not be true that nations are required to allow for this right to obtain in all circumstances. Maybe nations are morally required to protect different rights, and maybe freedom of movement is only one of the rights that they're required to protect. And maybe freedom of movement conflicts with other rights, and so nations are not morally required to allow for freedom of movement. Another argument is the anti-luck argument, and it goes, nations are morally required to give everyone an equal chance at a good life if their poor prospects are due to bad luck, i.e. circumstances beyond their control. Wealthy nations are able to give everyone such an equal chance only if they allow open borders. Therefore, wealthy nations are morally required to allow open borders. So here's another argument for globalization and immigration in a fairly permissive sense. So what might be some counters to the anti-luck argument? A first counter might be that nations are not morally required to give everyone an equal chance at a good life if their poor prospects are due to bad luck. Maybe nations are morally required to give everyone some chance, but maybe nations aren't required to repair the damage done by bad luck. Alternatively, a second counter could be that wealthy nations are able to give everyone such an equal chance, but not allow open borders. So maybe nations can provide the repair to bad luck, but this doesn't mean that they have to open borders. Maybe they can repair the bad luck without opening borders. Maybe this would involve giving aid to countries that have had bad luck, or some such thing. Another argument is the humanitarian aid argument. And it goes, if we are able to drastically improve someone's life at relatively little cost to ourselves, then we are morally obligated to do so. Opening our borders to immigrants would drastically improve their lives at relatively little cost to others. Therefore, we are morally obligated to open our borders to immigrants. Again, this is an argument in favor of immigration to the extent that it provides humanitarian aid. What might be some counters to the humanitarian aid argument? A first counter is that we are able to drastically improve someone's life at relatively little cost to ourselves, but we are not morally obligated to do so. So maybe we see somebody who we could help, but we don't think it's our moral obligation to help them. Maybe something else is required in order to morally obligate us to help them. A second counter could be that opening our borders to immigrants would not drastically improve their lives at relatively little cost to ourselves. So there may be two problems with opening borders to improve people's lives. First, it might cost us a lot to improve their lives. That would be a problem, because it wouldn't cost us a little, it would cost us a lot. And it would improve their lives, but that would come at great cost. Second, it could come at relatively little cost, but perhaps it wouldn't actually improve their lives. Maybe it would be a cost that we are willing to make, but it actually doesn't have the benefits that we think it will have. Or maybe it would be high cost and little benefit. Maybe the cost would actually be high and the benefit would actually be too little. Those could be considerations regarding counter number 2.